Ethan sat on the edge of their meticulously arranged living room, his hands clasped tightly together. The ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece seemed unusually loud, each tick hammering his growing unease. Rachel's laughter echoed from the kitchen, light and carefree, as she spoke on the phone. He couldn't quite hear the words, but something about her tone set his nerves on edge. This is not cool. It had started subtly, a new perfume she hadn't mentioned, late nights at work that left her oddly energized instead of tired, and a sudden insistence on separate plans. It wasn't Rachel's usual behavior, but whenever Ethan questioned her, she dismissed his concerns with a wave and a laugh. "You're overthinking again, Ethan," she'd say, her blue eyes sparkling with feigned sincerity. "Honestly, it's cute how paranoid you can be." But this time, Ethan felt the need to trust his instincts. He knew Rachel too well, better than she gave him credit for. The faint scent of cologne that wasn't his and her growing attachment to her phone during their evenings together were enough to prompt a deeper look. That evening, Rachel sauntered into the room dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and a skirt that hugged her curves. "I'm off to meet the team for drinks, don't wait up," she said, planting a perfunctory kiss on his cheek. "Team drinks again?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice neutral, though his stomach churned. "You've been going out with them a lot lately." She rolled her eyes playfully. "What can I say? Networking is part of the job. You know how it is." As the door closed behind her, Ethan felt a wave of determination wash over him. He had always been patient, a man who observed more than he spoke. But patience had its limits. Grabbing his coat and car keys, he decided tonight was the night to put his doubts to rest. The secluded park where Rachel had said her team would be gathering was dark and silent when Ethan arrived. He parked his car at a distance, cloak in the shadows, and walked closer on foot. The air was crisp, filled with the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Rachel's car parked near a cozy cafe. Ethan positioned himself discreetly behind a hedge near the cafe window. There she was, sitting at a small table, but she wasn't alone. Across from her sat Derek, a man Ethan recognized from one of her workplace photos. They leaned in close, their laughter muffled by the glass pane. Derek reached out, brushing Rachel's hand, and Ethan's stomach twisted. His suspicions had been painfully validated. Pulling out his smartphone, Ethan steadied his trembling hands and began recording. His mind raced, not just with the pain of betrayal, but with the beginnings of a plan. This was no time for an impulsive confrontation. He needed proof, and he needed to stay one step ahead. As the camera captured their intimate gestures and hushed exchanges, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. He would not let Rachel gaslight him into doubt. He would not confront her unprepared. Tonight was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated reckoning. Ethan replayed the footage on his phone, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face in the dark car. Every laugh Rachel shared with Derek, every stolen glance, felt like a hammer striking his chest. A part of him wanted to storm into the cafe and demand answers, to end the charade right there, but no, he couldn't afford to be rash. A misstep would only give Rachel the upper hand, and Ethan was determined to control the narrative this time. Instead, he drove home, the silence in the car punctuated by his shallow breaths. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant, a blur of streetlights and empty sidewalks. His mind raced, replaying every conversation, every interaction over the past few months. He realized now how carefully Rachel had covered her tracks, how her deflections had been laced with just enough charm to keep him from asking more questions. As he pulled into their driveway, Ethan sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house they had built together. Every brick, every room, every piece of furniture seemed to mock him now. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, their shared life. But Rachel had made it into something else, a facade, hiding her betrayal. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in their bed, listening to the quiet creaks of the house and the rhythmic sound of Rachel's breathing beside him. She had come home late, her excuses rehearsed and her demeanor casual. "Work ran late," she'd said, leaning down to kiss him on the cheek. The faint scent of wine and unfamiliar cologne lingered on her, setting his nerves on edge. He turned to watch her as she slept, her face serene and untroubled. How could she lie so effortlessly, he wondered, his hands clenching into fists under the covers. How long had this been going on? How much of their life together had been a lie? These questions burned in his mind, but there were no answers yet. Only Rachel had those, and Ethan was determined to extract them on his terms. The next day, Ethan began his plan. He called in sick to work, using the time to gather resources and prepare. He started by compiling everything he already knew: dates, excuses, changes in Rachel's behavior. Then he decided to dig deeper. He retrieved an old recording device from a box in the garage, something he'd used years ago for work presentations. It was small, discreet, and perfect for capturing audio without drawing attention. He even Ethan placed the device in Rachel's car under the passenger seat. He knew she often took phone calls while driving, work or otherwise. If she was careless enough to discuss Derek during one of those calls, he would have his proof. Next, he turned to her social media accounts. Rachel was meticulous about appearances, but Ethan noticed little inconsistencies. Her photos from recent outings were always taken by someone else, her captions vague about who she was with. He noted the places she frequented, cross-referencing them with Derek's check-ins. Patterns began to emerge. Patterns Rachel had underestimated him to notice. By the end of the day, Ethan had a clear picture of their next meeting spot. The secluded cafe wasn't a one-time rendezvous. It was their routine. They met there every Thursday evening, always around the same time. This gave Ethan the opportunity to not only record their interactions, but to set a trap. Thursday came faster than he anticipated, and Ethan found himself back at the cafe. This time, he came prepared with a high-quality camera and a longer lens, ensuring he could record from a safe distance without being seen. He positioned himself at a nearby park bench, partially hidden by bushes, with a direct line of sight into the cafe. Rachel arrived first, looking radiant in a fitted dress Ethan had never seen before. He felt a pang of sadness amidst his anger. She had dressed up for another man. Moments later, Derek joined her, his casual confidence grating on Ethan's nerves. The two greeted each other with familiarity, their laughter ringing out even from where Ethan sat. Through the lens, Ethan captured it all: the way Derek leaned in close, the way Rachel touched his arm, the way they smiled at each other as if the rest of the world didn't exist. This wasn't just a fling. This was something deeper, something they thought they could get away with. Ethan stayed longer this time, observing their interaction until they finally left the cafe together. He followed at a distance, his heart pounding as they drove to a nearby motel. Parking discreetly, Ethan waited until they entered before snapping a photo of Derek's car in the lot. Every piece of evidence he collected felt like another weight lifted from his chest, another step toward reclaiming his dignity. And then, Charger was trying to call him from a motel. In a few hours, Derek, back at home, Ethan reviewed his recordings and photos, organizing them meticulously. His emotions simmered just beneath the surface. Hurt, anger, betrayal. But he channeled it all into his preparations. When Rachel returned later that night, she found him in his study, calm and composed. "How was work?" he asked, his voice betraying none of his turmoil. Rachel paused, her smile faltering for just a moment. Long. I'm exhausted." Ethan nodded, watching her retreat to their bedroom. He had everything he needed now. All that was left was to decide how and when to confront her. The morning after Rachel's late return, Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, stirring his coffee with methodical precision. The weight of the evidence he had gathered pressed against him like a silent scream. Every photo, every recording, every detail whispered the same truth. The life he thought they had shared was a carefully constructed illusion. Rachel breezed into the room, her blonde hair falling perfectly into place, her face bright despite her claim of exhaustion the night before. She kissed him on the cheek, a routine gesture that now felt more like a mockery than affection. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, reaching for the orange juice. "Any plans for today?" Ethan forced a smile. "Just some errands," he replied, watching her closely. Rachel didn't seem to notice the tension in his voice. Her mind elsewhere, she tapped away on her phone. Ethan wondered if she was texting Derek. The day passed in quiet observation. Ethan kept himself busy, staying close to his phone in case the recording device in Rachel's car picked up anything useful. By the afternoon, it had delivered. A conversation between Rachel and Derek, their voices low but clear enough to betray their plans for another meeting. They spoke in code, but the intent was unmistakable. "I can't wait to see you," Derek's voice murmured through the playback. Rachel laughed softly. "Tonight can't come soon enough." Ethan's jaw tightened. Tonight would be their last secret meeting. That evening, Rachel announced she was heading out again. Another work thing? Ethan asked, keeping his tone casual, as he set down the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. Yes, just a small get-together. I won't be late, Rachel replied, smoothing her skirt. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in to kiss him goodbye. Don't wait up, okay? Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Have fun. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan felt his mask of calmness slip for a moment. He clenched his fists, drawing deep breaths to steady himself. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. Gathering the evidence he'd compiled, he slipped it into a slim black folder and grabbed his keys. Tonight, Rachel's facade would crumble. The cafe was quiet when Ethan arrived, its dimly lit interior casting long shadows against the walls. He parked a safe distance away and made his way to the same vantage point he had used before. His heart thudded in his chest as he saw Rachel and Derek seated at their usual table. Their faces were animated, their gestures intimate. Ethan lifted his camera, capturing every detail, the way Derek's hand lingered on Rachel's, the way her eyes lit up when he leaned in to whisper something. He felt a strange mix of fury and clarity. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his control. After snapping several photos, Ethan decided it was time to act. He slipped his phone into his pocket, took a deep breath, and entered the cafe. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. Rachel froze mid-loft, her eyes widening as she saw him. Derek turned in his seat, his expression shifting from confusion to unease. Ethan? Rachel's voice was sharp, laced with panic. What are you doing here? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He walked over to their table, his movements deliberate, and placed the black folder on the table between them. What's this? Derek asked, attempting to sound nonchalant but failing to hide the nervous edge in his voice. Proof, Ethan said evenly, his gaze fixed on Rachel. Proof of what's been going on behind my back. Rachel's face drained of color. She glanced at the folder but didn't open it. Ethan, this isn't what it looks like. Horn. Spare me the lies, Ethan interrupted, his voice cold but controlled. I've seen enough, heard enough. Do you really think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't put the pieces together? Derek shifted uncomfortably, his confidence faltering. Look, man, I think you're overreacting. Overreacting? Ethan turned his attention to Derek, his eyes flashing with restrained anger. You think sneaking around with my wife for months is something I should take lightly? Let me assure you, Derek, I've been nothing but patient. But patience has its limits. The cafe staff and a few patrons were now watching the scene unfold, their whispers and glances adding to the tension. Rachel looked around nervously, her composure cracking under the weight of the public exposure. Ethan, please, she began, her voice trembling. Can we talk about this at home? Ethan shook his head. No, Rachel, we're doing this here and now. You don't get to sweep this under the rug. He turned back to Derek. And you don't get to walk away unscathed either. With that, Ethan opened the folder and began laying out the evidence. Photos of their meetings, screenshots of messages, and transcripts of their recorded conversations. The color drained from Derek's face as he realized the depth of Ethan's preparation. I've already sent copies of this to my lawyer, Ethan said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. So don't bother trying to deny anything. Rachel buried her face in her hands, her carefully constructed world crumbling before her eyes. Derek muttered something about leaving, but Ethan's glare stopped him in his tracks. You're not going anywhere, Ethan said. Not until you both hear exactly what's coming next. He straightened, his voice calm but resolute. I filed for divorce, Rachel. The papers will be served tomorrow. As for you, Derek, I've made sure this little affair won't just ruin my marriage. It'll ruin your reputation, too. Your boss will know, your colleagues will know, and trust me, it won't end there. Rachel's sobs filled the cafe as Derek sat in stunned silence. Ethan felt a surge of empowerment. This was his moment, his justice. He picked up the folder, gave them one last look, and walked out of the cafe, leaving them to face the wreckage they had created. Ethan walked away from the cafe, the cold night air biting at his skin as he tightened his coat around him. The quiet hum of the city seemed almost soothing compared to the storm of emotions raging inside him. Despite the satisfaction of confronting Rachel and Derek, an empty ache remained, a stark reminder of what had been lost. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing grounding him. The confrontation had been cathartic in its way, but it had also left him with questions. Had there been signs earlier? Was there a point where he could have stopped this from happening? When Ethan reached the house, it felt foreign, like a shell of the life he had once known. He stepped inside and stood in the foyer, staring at the space where Rachel's heels always sat neatly by the door. Now, the floor was empty, devoid of the small, ordinary things that once made this house a home. He made his way to the living room and sank into the couch, pulling out his phone. A message from his lawyer waited for him, confirming that the divorce papers would be served the next morning. There was no turning back now. The evidence was undeniable, the confrontation final. Ethan was no longer the man who would let himself be manipulated. The next morning, Rachel returned home, her face pale and her demeanor subdued. She hesitated in the doorway, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Ethan," she began softly, as though testing the waters. "Can we talk?" Ethan didn't look up from the kitchen counter where he was slicing fruit for breakfast. "Talk about what? The lies? The betrayal? Or maybe how you thought I was too blind to notice?" Rachel flinched at the venom in his voice. I I made a mistake," she stammered. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Derek didn't mean anything to me. It was just—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted, slamming the knife onto the cutting board. "Don't insult me by pretending it was meaningless. You don't meet someone weekly, laugh with them, share secrets, and take them to a motel if it doesn't mean anything." Rachel's lips trembled as she struggled to find the words. I I wasn't happy, Ethan. You've been so distant lately, so caught up in work. I felt invisible." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "Invisible? I worked my ass off to provide for us, to build this life together. While I was doing that, you were sneaking around with him, so don't you dare blame this on me." Rachel sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how it came to this," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well, congratulations, you did." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's sobs were the only sound, but Ethan felt no pity. He had spent weeks drowning in his pain, but now he saw clearly. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about reclaiming control of his life. By mid-afternoon, the papers were delivered. Rachel stood in the doorway, holding the envelope with trembling hands. She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading. "You really doing this?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze, his expression resolute. "What did you expect, Rachel? That I'd just forgive and forget, that we could go back to the way things were?" Rachel didn't answer. She simply nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she disappeared into the bedroom to pack a bag. As she moved through the house, Ethan felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. Watching her gather her things, he couldn't help but think about the good times they had shared, the vacations, the quiet evenings, the dreams they once built together. But those memories were now tainted, overshadowed by her betrayal. In the days that followed, Ethan began to rebuild. He cleared out the remnants of Rachel's presence, her clothes, her books, her favorite throw pillows. Each item he removed felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders, a step closer to reclaiming his space and his identity. He also started reaching out to friends he had drifted away from during his marriage, old college buddies, former colleagues, even his sister, who lived a few towns over. They rallied around him, offering support and encouragement. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to his marriage. But the process wasn't without its challenges. Late at night, when the house was silent and still, the doubts crept in. Was he too harsh? Could he have saved their relationship if he had tried harder? These thoughts gnawed at him, but he reminded himself of Rachel's choices. She had made her bed, now she had to lie in it. Meanwhile, Rachel struggled with the fallout. Derek, ever the opportunist, distanced himself from her almost immediately. The relationship that had seemed so thrilling in secret crumbled under the weight of exposure. Rachel was left alone, her once polished facade shattered. Ethan heard about her struggles through mutual acquaintances. She had moved into a small apartment across town, far from the life of comfort they had shared. There were whispers of regret, of her trying to reach out to him, but Ethan ignored them. He had no intention of reopening old wounds. Instead, he focused on the future. He took up hobbies he had long neglected: golf, hiking, even photography. Each activity reminded him of who he was before Rachel's betrayal, before his world had been upended. Slowly but surely, he was finding himself again. And as the weeks turned into months, Ethan came to realize that Rachel's betrayal, while painful, had also been a catalyst. It had forced him to confront truths he had ignored, to reevaluate his priorities, and to rediscover his strength. In the end, her deceit had set him free. Months had passed since the storm of betrayal tore through Ethan's life, leaving him to pick up the pieces. The wounds Rachel's actions had inflicted were healing, but the scars remained, a quiet reminder of the lessons he had learned and the resilience he had discovered within himself. The house, once a shared symbol of their life together, was now unmistakably his. Gone were the decorative touches Rachel had insisted on, the floral curtains, the ornate vases, and the throw pillows she so loved. In their place were clean, minimalistic designs that reflected Ethan's renewed sense of clarity. He had turned the house into a sanctuary, a space that no longer carried the weight of shared secrets. Ethan's routine was different now. He woke early, savoring the stillness of the morning as he sipped his coffee on the porch. He had taken up jogging, a habit he had let go of years ago, and he found solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. It wasn't just about physical fitness. It was about reclaiming control of his life, one step at a time. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan sat in a local park with his sister Clara. She had been a steady source of support during the chaos, always ready with a listening ear and practical advice. "You seem lighter," Clara observed, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Like you finally let go." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I have. For a while, I was so focused on what I'd lost that I didn't see what I'd gained." "And was that myself?" Ethan said simply. "I spent years trying to be the perfect husband, the perfect provider. I lost sight of who I was outside of all that." Clara squeezed his hand. "You're stronger now, Ethan. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the moment. He glanced at the screen and saw Rachel's name. She hadn't contacted him directly since the divorce was finalized, and he hesitated before answering. "Ethan," Rachel's voice was tentative, almost fragile. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to call." "What is it, Rachel?" Ethan asked, his tone neutral but guarded. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I wanted to apologize for everything. I've had a lot of time to think, and I realize how much I hurt you." Ethan exhaled, the weight of her words settling over him. He had imagined this moment countless times, wondering if it would bring him closure or reopen old wounds. "I appreciate the apology," he said finally, "but you need to understand that I've moved on. I'm not the same person I was when this all started." "I understand," Rachel said softly. "I just wanted you to know that I regret everything. Truly." Ethan ended the call with a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to believe her, to find comfort in her remorse. But another part knew that he didn't need her regret to validate his healing. He had found his peace on his own. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to envision a future unbound by the past. He started attending a photography club where he met people who shared his newfound passion. One member, a woman named Julia, caught his attention. She was warm and genuine, with a quick wit that brought a smile to Ethan's face. Their conversation started casually, revolving around lenses and lighting techniques, but over time, they grew deeper. Julia had her own story of heartbreak, and she admired Ethan's strength in rebuilding his life. "You've been through so much," she said one evening as they walked along the riverbank, cameras in hand. "But you don't seem bitter. How do you do it?" Ethan thought for a moment before replying. "I think I realized that holding on to anger would only keep me tied to what hurt me. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the pain define you." Julia smiled, her eyes bright. "That's a lesson I could stand to learn." Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time: hope. It wasn't just about starting a new relationship, it was about opening himself to the possibilities life still had to offer. On a quiet evening, Ethan sat on his porch, looking out at the stars. The phone call with Rachel no longer lingered in his mind, nor did the betrayal that had once consumed him. Instead, he thought about the new paths he was carving, the passions he was rediscovering, and the people he was meeting along the way. The pain of the past had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. He was free to define his life on his terms. Unburdened by deceit or regret, for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. A man who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. As the cool breeze whispered through the trees, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. And as he leaned back in his chair, he knew one thing for certain. The best chapters of his story were yet to be written.